Habari gani, karibuni, asanteni kwa kuwa nasi. Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to Kumbukeni, as Milton calls it, the global universe, where you get stories about Africa from an African perspective. We are here, myself, Nduku, together with my brothers, countering the false narrative that Western media has propagated on Africa for centuries and still do. As we do our research, we encounter the different articles that are put out that are very comical as far as how they describe us and how they see us. I'll actually be putting out a critical analysis of one of them soon. Brother Adesoji, Brother Milton.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adesoji Ginla, reaching you from London, the heart of empire, the one, as you all know, give you the language you're conversing in, and yes, the mother of all imperialists.
Not my mother, but go on.
The empire on which the sun never sets, and yes, reaching from the heart of the global financial capital, which is London. So, good evening and welcome.
New York will have something to say about that. You hold on.
Yes,
I don't know if you got the memo on Bretton Woods, but we will have something to say about that. Alimadi?
No, it's interesting that as I'm listening to comrades speak, I know now Britain relives its imperial glory through the United States.
Right.
You know? No, really, it's so ironic, you know, because the U.S. was once a British colony, but now Britain has to root for the U.S. Because it mirrors the imperial heydays of Britain.
I wonder how painful that pill is to swallow.
It is. And now I understand now, it is everyone speaking, why they're so hostile to China. Because China, of course, is the new rival to the United States. Have you seen the last two issues of The Economist?
No, I haven't.
The front cover, 2 weeks in a row, anti-China. It is so, no pretense about it, you know?
Yeah, please mail me your copies when you're done. I would love to read through them. Do you get hard copies or do you get it online?
No, I don't give them the benefit of my hard-earned dollars. I read it at Barnes and Noble.
I'll do that too. That's a good idea. All right, I'll go there tomorrow.
So, comrades, this is Milton Alimadi from New York City, the seat of global capital, the declining empire. Welcome, as Sister Nduku said, to our global platform where we share lessons with you, and through your comments and interaction, we also learn from you.
Yes, we do. We're all teaching each other and learning from each other. So today we're going to be talking about Gabon. It seems like a never-ending conversation, coups, just constantly. You think you're done with one and another one pops up. And
it's a good thing.
We'll see. Let's talk and dice it up and see whether this one's a good thing. So Gabon is in the news, putting Niger to shame and sending it to the back of the burner. Adesoji, why don't you open us up by telling us what happened?
Yes. So to understand what happened last week, you have to go back in time. Precisely 2 dates in particular. August 24, 1958, Charles de Gaulle, the Prime Minister of France, declared his support for, in inverted commas, self-determination by the French colonies. Whoever desires independence shall immediately obtain it, he says. So it then follows that September 28th of the same year, a series of referendums were carried out across all the French colonies. Every one of them, bar Guinea, said yes. Some gave a qualified yes. Togo, Mali gave a qualified yes. The rest unequivocally, accepted the terms of said referendum, which essentially was the pact of continued colonization, as it was called then, the agreement you had to sign. And so it follows on that in August 1960, a series of countries would obtain independence almost a day, every other day after each other, with particular reference to the case in point today, Gabon. would become independent. For those who don't know where Gabon is, Cameroon is referred to as the armpit of Africa. Gabon will be the rib of Africa. So if you look at your body, you sort of know where the rib is, so you immediately know where Gabon is. And so what transpired? The first president that was elected in Gabon was Léon Mba. Léon Mba would lead Gabon until 1968, when he was toppled by a quasi-coup, constitutional and military. But the French gendarmes will fly in from Congo, Brazzaville, across the river, and from Senegal to restore him to power. He would later die a year later, and then will bring us Ali Bongo, the father of the recently deposed Ali Bongo. Omar Bongo, sorry. Omar Bongo. He will then rule until the mid-90s, when he passed on, and the son will take over. So why is this coup odd, to use the political commentator? It's odd in the sense that an election had just recently taken place, although the results of which had still been disputed. The ink has not even dried on the collated number of the elections. And so the dawn of Tuesday, the army will strike. And strike they did. But here's the curious thing about that strike. It followed a pattern that we've seen elsewhere. It followed the pattern of Niger Republic, meaning it was a member of the presidential guard. So the leader of the presidential guard. Yeah. I mean, and the reason I said member, you would understand. So it was a leader of the presidential guard. Another presidential guard also constitutes a contingent of French legionnaires. So question is, why did the French allow this coup to happen, wherein they were trying to put out the fire in Niger? And no sooner had that coup gone through, the guy will come forward, and the first thing he said is, we are going to organize a transitional government. Juxtapose that against the Nigerian coup, where they also said we were going to organize a transitional government. Now, France would say no to the one in Niger, but they've been very quiet to the one in Gabon. And the Americans too, to quote the word of the Secretary for African Affairs in the White House, Mr. John Kirby, who said, the coup in Gabon, although very worrying, does not follow usual trends. I wonder what he was talking about. But we'll get to the nitty-gritty of everything in the course of our conversation.
Yeah. So, in fact, the AU is apparently against a military intervention. And it's a great juxtapose for Niger. If Africans were smart, they would use it to argue the case in Niger and expose the hypocrisy that the West is. So we'll be answering two questions today. Are these coups revolutionary or not? And the second question is, what is the role of the military in Africa? What is it and what should it be if it's not working for us? And we'll go through different observations as we talk about each of them. So let's address this one. Are these coups revolutions or not? And as I was answering this question, I went to look ahead at the meaning of revolution. A revolution, one of the meanings of a revolution, is a forcible overthrow of a government or a social order in favor of a new system. So for me, as I was looking at that and interpreting it, I'm saying, when you overthrow the government, you have to have a new system, a structured new system. You can't just overthrow the government and sit there and talk about, oh, we promised democracy, but it's going to take time. You have to have something in place if it is a revolution. So, brothers, what do you both think? And let's focus on Gabon, and then we can extend.
Well, I think Brother Adesoji has already laid out the Gabon one. Gabon one is a palace coup. the guy, General, first of all, I'm very concerned by his name.
You have a problem with his name?
Nguema. Do you know the name Nguema? In Equatorial Africa.
I don't know what it means.
Equatorial Guinea.
Equatorial Guinea.
What does it mean?
Nguema, the current Nguema and the prior Nguema are one of the worst dictators in the African continent. So the name alone, even though he may not be related to them, I'm saying he's starting off on a wrong footing already.
But given the history of the partitioning of Africa, there would be no surprise if we find they're connected.
Absolutely. And then the second point, of course, is that he's a cousin to Ali Bongo, the deposed president. So that, of course, shows the troubling connection. But when I said it's still good anyway, it comes at a time when the African youth are being affected and influenced in events in other African countries. So whether he intended it to be a palace coup with the advice and encouragement of the French, I think it's material because it will turn out to be a transitional takeover. And we will have another one, just like we saw in Burkina Faso. Before the current leader, who is the leader now in Burkina Faso? Remember, there was a coup, right?
Yes.
And then he, in turn,
pulled
out another coup because they could tell that the first coup was too accommodating. In fact, they had reached out to Compaoré, remember? Blaise Compaoré, the assassin of Thomas Sankara. So the other junior officers said, no, this is not an authentic coup. So if the one in Gabon is not an authentic coup, number one, it's good in the sense that I don't think Bongo will be restored. Number two, if they show their true colors, which is reactionary, they in turn will be removed.
Yeah.
I think the officers that seem to be on a more progressive path now, like the ones in Mali and the ones in Burkina Faso, are now influencing the actions, not only of the youth in the region, but of other officers in the military. They may, in fact, be in direct communication with them. After all, we know that when the French and ECOWAS threatened to invade Niger, what happened? The leaders in Burkina Faso and in Mali, not only did they declare that they would also militarily support Niger, they actually signed documents authorizing their intervention. You see? So I think the time for stopgap coups, I think are almost over or ending in Africa. So that's what I wanted to say about the one in Gabon, even if they intended it to be reactionary. In fact, even the one in Mali might not initially have been a progressive coup.
In Niger or Mali?
In Mali.
Okay.
In fact, at the time that Assimi Goïta overthrew Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta in 2020, what was going on in Mali? Street protests on a daily basis, led by students' unions, led by trade unions, led by women's organizations. So they were on the path to revolution already in Mali. In fact, the first coup, some people saw it as an attempt to really stop the revolution, to preempt the revolution. But then the revolution, of course, kept going with its own momentum. The protest did not stop. I think at that point, Assimi Goïta and his colleagues, whether they had an agenda to be progressive or not, they had no choice. That was the only way that they too could survive. And they've taken that path so far. And Burkina Faso has taken that path so far. So before I turn to Comrade Adesoji, I just wanted to make one observation in terms of his introductory explanation, which was perfect. But in terms of Guinea being the only one that voted yes, I'm now reassessing my own views on that. And I think we need to do some more studying on that. Because when I was doing research on Niger, in Niger, the first leader was basically installed by the French. They had voted, and he would, of course, voted yes. His party voted yes. The other party that voted no supposedly lost, but there are reports, contemporary reports at that time, that the French manipulated the outcome of that election. So now I'm thinking, maybe in Guinea, they could not manipulate the outcome. In other places, we know they probably voted yes, like under Senghor, Leopold Senghor. I know they probably would vote yes. But there's possible that in addition to Guinea, there might have been other leaders who voted no. In Niger, they set an example to that leader who dared to vote no. They banned his political parties. The members who did not stood with him were absorbed into the party that voted yes, and they banned all political parties. This is the French doing it from independence in 1960. Niger was a one-party state from the get-go because of France. Think about that. And the guy was there for like 14 years until they had the first coup in 1974, I believe. But by that time, no semblance of democracy was able to be established in Niger. And now they're crying, oh, look what the Niger military did. They overthrew this democratically elected Bazoum in Niger. You are the one that destroyed the possibility of democracy from the get-go in Niger.
Yes, I have to also chime in on the Niger situation. The party you refer to were known as the Sawabas, the peasants.
Absolutely.
The leader of the party mysteriously died in a car accident 6 months after that.
Talk about a trend in Africa now. That's a trend we need to talk about.
That referendum. And also there's a possibility they could have voted no in Cameroon. Because if you remember, the leader of the party at the time, the UPD, was Felix Momi, was also poisoned in a Swiss hotel, following an interview with a supposedly French journalist, a trusted French journalist.
Right.
So
it actually was intelligence, you know.
It was intelligence.
You gotta be careful where you eat, Black people. Be careful where
for real.
So the question
thanks for that addition. Thank you.
No worries. So the question then is, why is the one in Gabon different? Well, it's peculiar, not different, but peculiar for a reason. 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, before what's his name? Omar Bongo suffered a stroke. He had been dallying because they just recently discovered. Sorry?
Ali
Bongo, yeah. I keep missing the Omar is the dad, yeah. I keep missing the.
Let's establish in case you miss it again.
Okay, so
Omar
it's
Bongo is the
No. Just say Odimba. Odimba is the son. Odimba is the son.
There you go.
So Odimba is the son. So that's the way we can, So.
Or the younger crook.
Yeah, so Odimba is the son. The one who said we should make noise. Yeah, so we'll make noise today.
We are making it today.
So Odimba, just before the pandemic, Gabon had discovered a new oil deposit just off the coast of Gabon. And Odimba has been speaking to the Americans. And the French were not particularly enamored about that idea. It's almost like you're coming into a backyard to come on. Yes, you can play with the manganese, you can play with the uranium, but the oil, no, you can't do that.
The French don't like to share.
And so, according to the observers, one would assume that it was the French saying, well, if we're going to take out this guy, there's no perfect time like now. And you notice in my opening, I said the French gendarmes are part of the presidential guard.
Right.
So why would they allow something like this to transpire? Because there is no way such a thing would have been going on without these guys being in the know.
And his wife is also French.
Right?
Exactly.
So you're saying the people guarding the president of Gabon, an African man, there are Frenchmen in that unit.
Well,
I mean, one of his ministers is a European.
There you go. This is the problem in Africa.
And also, you have to take into cognizance the pact of continued colonization was the embedding of their military, into the civil service, and then, so it's no gainsaying that would happen. So, yes, I mean, to the outsider, it might seem odd that you have independence, but yet you don't have independence or agency to determine who does what or who goes where or what in Africa. So, I suppose the point I'm trying to lie is the French do not want to lose influence again in Gabon. So I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and the question was, if you had to choose between Niger, quite ridiculous, obviously, but if you had to choose between Niger and Gabon, which would you rather give up? Knowing fully well that one has everything the other one has, and the other one doesn't have that much. So who would you rather give up? Would you rather give up Niger or Gabon?
Who's making me give them up?
They have no choice with Niger right now. When you have protests of tens of thousands of people outside the French military base, I think the handwriting is on the wall. What are you going to do? You're going to fight them?
Yeah. And the positioning of Gabon too is an advantageous positioning. Gabon is much more, it's not in the desert like Niger is. And as you can see, they have much more influence. They are embedded literally from the wife of the president or the former president to the administration throughout the Gabon government.
Now, can you see?
Most of the ministries also have
French, and the banks administrated by Frenchmen.
Can you see now you're having a geopolitical conversation because you're making up what should be in the best interest of France. That is how absurd the whole thing is. Because what they've done...
The worst part of this is not, they're not doing it because they have any special hatred for Africans or what have you. They just want Africa and Africans to subsidize their high standard of living.
They're greedy and selfish.
At the cost of diminishing the African standard of living and impoverishing them.
They are capitalists, right? It's capitalism.
Yes,
you accumulate at the expense of others. They produce,
exactly, especially the ones that have no bargaining power because they're not organized enough. The only way, Nkrumah said, and we'll get to that later, that they can have bargaining power is by uniting.
Yeah.
That's, you can see it in simplistic economic terms. The other one has power, has NATO. You are scattered, all these small countries, so you don't have the bargaining power. They extract and you suffer.
Yeah.
So, of course, they're not going to let that go that easily.
And also, to buttress your point with regards to why are they doing it, the Paris mayor, underscored that very point when he said it's hard to let go because this is in France's best interest to maintain the status quo. Of course there are going to be people who would subscribe to that ideologue even within the African community.
Yeah.
For example, Lassana Conte Alassana Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire. Now I'm remembering Lassana Conte. He worked with the French in Guinea. Alassana Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire and Macky Sall in Senegal. These are guys who believe in the French Afrique project.
Good for them. If it makes them happier, good
Lord
for them.
have mercy.
But
No,
don't carry us with you. Don't take us with you. If it's that,
if they go live in France,
but the thing is this: it's ironic. They can comfortably take that position because they're well compensated. They've embezzled a lot of funds. They live in luxury. They have the best things in life. So it's very convenient and easy for them to take that position. Very hypocritical.
As you continue to talk, something that might help us understand Ali Bongo, Adesoji, and this thing of the French being so, because I honestly don't know any other African country apart from South Africa that has so many white people in government and in official positions. But he went to school in France and had most of his education there since the age of 9 years old. So this is something he's used to, an environment around white people. I mean, which explains also his situation with it. But I don't know if this means anything to us. The fact that this man basically grew up in France.
It's not unique to Odimba Bongo. It's not unique to him. In fact, the French actually have a system called the Evoyer. So one of complete assimilation. You forget the fact that you're an African. You buy into the Franc-Afrique project. Léopold Senghor is another example of that. Houphouët-Boigny in late Houphouët-Boigny left Léopold Senghor, and so what's his name? Eyadema. Their names escaped me now. But to say he's unique, no, he's not unique. And also, it ties into what the French has laid, the legacy of which the French colonial project has laid down in French-speaking West Africa. So when I say French-speaking, colonial,
former French colony.
Yeah. So it's not unique to him. In fact, if you go through all these countries, that you will have that. How can I say, petty bourgeois class that would ascribe to everything French to the detriment of their Africanness.
Yeah.
So is it unique to him? No, not really. In the grand scheme of things, in 2023, should that be a shocker? No. But it's odd, but it shouldn't be, because France has a way of ingratiating themselves into the very fabric of where they need to get stuff out. They don't mind, being your toe rag, as long as they get what. I mean, a classic example is, if you look at Gabon, when they drill the oil, 1/3 of the revenue from the oil goes to what's it called? Goes to France.
France. Mentions that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if that is the case, you would expect, them to be well compensated. And yes, they are. They're well compensated to the point where if it comes to killing their population on behalf of the French project, if that is what needs to be done, it will be done without batting an eyelid. It will be done. And every one of them across the former French-speaking colonies have replicated the same thing. So are we shocked? No, we shouldn't be, because you just need to study the colonial project. Once you study the colonial project, what's his name? Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask.
Yep.
Actually lays it down. Actually lays it down perfectly. They're flunkies. That's all they are. They're flunkies. So when the Frenchman comes around, they cower into their position. Is yes sir, yes sir, yes sir. Once the white man goes and they're going to speak to one, they will take the position or the voice of the Frenchman and start rolling their R's, in perfect, mimicking the one who was before them, so that they impose that. Léopold Senghor is a perfect example of that. In fact, he's on record as saying, when he was asked, when do you suppose it's time for Senegal to start asserting its agency or its Africanness? He said, no. We're going to be the perfect black Frenchman. And
it's quite sad.
Yeah, but I think we should see it not really so much as the fault, but in the power of psychological indoctrination, since it is so pervasive, it's really psychological warfare, and it was part of their foreign policy.
Yes.
To make Africans in their colonies hate themselves and aspire to be Europeans. So the ones that were seen as highly successful are the ones who were even able to be elected to the French parliament in metropolitan France before independence. So when you have that being disseminated within that colony, as this is the epitome of success, it's very difficult for somebody to develop a different type of consciousness that is contrary to that. So in fact, that's why it's very surprising when we end up with people like Felix Mumi, when we end up with people like, Patrice Lumumba, all these emerging in former French colony. When you have, of course, the most brilliant of all, Cheikh Anta Diop from Senegal.
Yeah.
And that is why the Senegalese state, after independence, really put obstacles on his path, literally locked him up, frustrated all his academic efforts, because he was working toward true liberation, beginning with liberation of the mind.
Yes.
And then in terms of the influence of French and how they control the politics, before Leon Mba died, when he was in the hospital, Omar Bongo was taken to meet with, first of all, they made him make Omar Bongo. Before they made him make Omar Bongo the vice president, Omar Bongo was taken to meet with De Gaulle. And De Gaulle approved, said, okay, we can have him as our man. And then he was made vice president. And then Leon Mba was in a French hospital, and they were in charge of his treatment. I'm not saying he was not going to die at some point anyway, but eventually he did die.
That is something dangerous to throw out in the presence of minds like ours. Hold up, brother. What did you say?
No, it's worth looking further into, is all I'm saying.
Hold up.
But anyway,
did you say they were in charge of his medical treatment?
Of course, he was in a French hospital in Paris.
He was in a French hospital, yes.
In Paris, right?
Yeah.
In fact,
one of the finest, actually.
They had a sham election,
and
when he won, quote unquote, won re-election, he took his swearing in at the Gabon embassy in Paris.
In Paris,
and then went back to the hospital.
Went back to hospital to get back on his bed.
And then Omar became.
When you speak about it out loud, it's so obvious. It's so obvious. It's angering that we're being played.
Yeah.
Anyway, on that note, as we talk about whether this is a revolution or not, I put in the chat some resources, and one of them was Crisis in the Peripheral by Dr. Walter Rodney.
Yes.
As I call him, Baba Rodney. And he says, one of the things, he says a lot. And every time I was just telling my brothers yesterday, every time I listen to this clip, this video, I see different observations coming out of it. But he's talking about the petty bourgeoisie. And he says that we have to shift, we the petty bourgeoisie, because he calls himself one. And by default, I guess we are petty bourgeoisie since we've had good education, we have good jobs and all that. We're not the masses who are suffering, and being subjugated by the system. So he said,
he was honest enough to admit that he belongs to an elite class.
He said that, and he says we have to shift our initiatives into the hands of the workers. And now I'm looking at what makes it a revolution and what makes it a coup, right? Yes. And I'm going to juxtapose it to Sankara. We have to shift our initiatives into the hands of the workers and peasants and begin to serve them. So he is saying that the movement, whether you call it a revolution or whatever you call it, has to be led from the point of view of the workers, not you, the bourgeoisie, because he says we are caught up in very petty and preoccupations, right? We need to hear what the workers are saying. And if we're going to be a part of the movement, lead it from their point of view. Right. Which is what I believe Sankara did.
Let them lead the party.
Exactly,
let
right?
Them have an authentic workers' party from the workers, by the workers, for the workers.
Yeah.
And that does not exist anywhere in Africa.
Yeah, which for me, I see the closest thing being Thomas Sankara. Once he comes in with a coup, he has a plan for them. But what do you think, brothers? That's my observation.
Well, so in order to understand whether a coup is revolutionary or just selfish, you just need to look at the characters involved. So I'll give you a couple. Eyadema, Kotaka, Lassana Conte. What's his name again? IBB, Ibrahim Babangida Abacha.
Let's see. Mm-hmm.
Yoweri Museveni.
That name lands very differently on me, man.
Matthew Kerekou.
Mm-hmm.
And then juxtapose them against Muritala Mohammed, Valentine Strasser.
Maybe go a little slower so that our community can write down these names if they want to, but they can watch the replay. Go on.
Valentine Strasser. So mention Sankara, Valentine Strasser, Gamel Nasser.
Amilcar Cabral was with the people.
Amilcar Cabral was not a military guy, so you can't. He was more revolutionary.
Revolutionary from the get-go.
I think he's giving you an
from
the ground up.
That seized power.
Yeah, so this is people that seize power as opposed to someone that
But he was a petty bourgeoisie. We go by Walter Rodney's description, who went to the people and rose from there.
Yes, right.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so. Again, in the class of the revolutionary, you would say Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned, what's his name? Dr. Walter Rodney.
Mm-hmm.
They say a leader leads by example. And by that, I mean, you have to watch whoever says anything and you have to see what their demeanor is. And yes, Samora Machel, yes, Mozambique. So you have to lead by example. And by that, you will find Walter Rodney's example in Groundings with My Brothers,
mm-hmm.
where he went to sit with the Rastafarians mm-hmm. and said he actually learned more from them as opposed to what he brought to them. So there are the classic case of how you would allow yourself to sit with someone and understand and listen, not just talk, but listen. Because he said anytime he goes to them, he learns more than he brought to them. So question is, would the petty bourgeoisie in Africa allow that to be? No, because one, they're used to a particular lifestyle. They would not want to give that up. And so why would I want to give that up so that you can be slightly more comfortable than you currently are? Of course not.
Because I'm holding you by the neck.
So the military,
go on.
So one way of determining whether these coups are altruistic or not
mm-hmm.
is a quote Sankara gave, which was, a soldier without an ideology is nothing more than a bandit.
Exactly.
So I'm sure the guy in Uganda would not call himself a bandit. He did write a book, actually. He said one of the problems with African leaders is that they stay too long. Yeah. Projection is a very, very powerful thing. If you
and this is his 38th year.
When did he write that book? On his 26th year?
He actually wrote the book on the dawn of the century, the year 2000.
Yeah,
so he wrote it while he was existing for too long.
He's a charlatan. He knows all the right words because he studied all the right people, but he does not put them in practice, Also, to add to what Comrade Adesoji just said, Rawlings, from the get-go, had a plan, right? Sankara, of all of them, had the plan. He had been drawing his plan, I think, probably since he was a teenager, right? He studied the role of the military in Madagascar, how they intervened there, and they introduced, agrarian reform, right? So he was jotting this down as part of his plans.
So that is someone who's going with a plan already when he joins the military.
And he reads a lot. He read a lot. There's a short interview. Unfortunately, only a few pages. I wish it had been longer. In the book, Sankara Speaks, where the reporter is asking him about the books he reads.
I love his answer. I love his answer.
Right.
I love his answer.
I think we should revisit that when we do another update.
I love his answer. I love his answer.
But this is an African leader who had a plan and a vision to where he could take his people. All these coups, that we are talking about now, the contemporary ones, they are a little opportunistic, right?
Yes.
They're not the case of Assimi Goïta in Mali, saying the civilian authority are blocking me from implementing this plan I've had for a long time, which would be beneficial to the people of Mali. That was not the case. Their main issue was the stress of fighting the
insurgents.
Yes, the insurgents, the so-called jihadis, who, by the way, were empowered by the French by having destroyed Libya, and all those sophisticated weapons became available, right? That was number
collective
one.
Though, NATO, yeah.
Right, a collective. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. You're right. And then the second thing, they were observing what was going on in the ground. The government had become unpopular because of those protests on a daily basis that I referred to earlier. So that's a distinct difference, right? In Burkina Faso, the same thing, facing the stress of fighting the so-called jihadists, displaced millions of people in the country, that war. Hunger is up because nobody is cultivating the land. Farmers are being killed when they try to cultivate the land. Mm-hmm. People are living in internal refugee camps. So those are the pressures that motivated the coup in Burkina Faso as well. In Niger, the same thing. This seemed to have been some personal beef between General Chian and President Bazoum. He's the leader of the Presidential Guard. And he basically just said, okay, from today onwards, you are no longer the president, mm-hmm. right? Now the revolutionary possibilities are being pushed by the fact that young Africans are coming out to express their frustration, right? Mm-hmm. You have a continent where 60+% of the population is under the age of 25. In some countries, unemployment from 60% to 70%. And we see the evidence of young people drowning. Can you imagine? People are drowning and dying, and you're still taking that risk because they're trying to run away from these impoverished conditions. Mm-hmm. So now they're hoping these military interventions will be progressive and make an effective change. And of course, this is an opportunity for the so-called elite that Rodney referred to, mm-hmm. that he included himself in, could offer recommendation, advice, suggestions, and maybe even spark the youth to keep their foot on the pedal so that none of these military folks turn out to be reactionary, mm-hmm. and try to take them back.
So as you talk about the stresses that the people are facing and them leaving to go find other places that they can build a life for themselves and live in a decent, not even extravagant or luxurious, but just a decent life. As I was going through Neocolonialism by Nkrumah, and now I'm thinking of Nguema, right? The head of the military that is now acting president in Gabon. Nkrumah points out that Adesoji mentioned this, half of the domestic product in Gabon is paid to resident expatriates and overseas farms who own plantations and mines. I think that is the case in every African country, that most of their money is going to the white people. Most of the money that is made there is going to the white people, either directly individuals or through organizations and NGOs. Let's not forget the NGOs that are taking money out of there.
Actually, indirectly directly by the terms of trade. So exactly. What Nkrumah referred to when he wrote that was in 1965. Mm-hmm. So now, because that's a bit too blatant, you still have blatant situations, but not too much. Yeah. Now they've changed the mechanism. Now, your raw materials, you sell literally at peanuts rate to them, and you import them manufactured at the highly inflated differential. That's how they're now the most pervasive way of extracting resources from Africa now.
But the other thing I was thinking about too, and this goes to the issue of terrorism, right? And the fact that they are bringing bases to Africa to help with the issue of terrorism. These are capitalists. So what is the price, I was asking myself, that Africa is paying for this help that we are getting? Because they have to charge us at one point. We have to pay for it because they don't give anything for free, right? Including aid, they don't give it to you for free. So what are the services that the West is providing in Africa today that we are paying for without getting anything in return? I was thinking of those three, if we can have a short conversation on that to show the pressures that are
in Niger is very
bearing.
straightforward. The uranium. The uranium.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So for the uranium, we're not even
paying
getting
for it.
paid.
They've already amassed a surplus as a result of the uranium. And obviously there's no way would they allow the jihadis to take power and threaten their source of uranium. They don't care anything about.
Which is why the war on jihadism, which is why that war is so extended, right? Because the source of payment for that service is what? If it's uranium, then they'll never solve the problem.
No, there's no payment per se. There is no payment. It is just a question of, this is a resource we need. We consider it vital to our national interest. We'll go anywhere and place ourselves in the middle. So as long as we assure ourselves, the price is not monetary, neither it's just presence. Their presence is the price they pay to get access to it. You're not paying them anything.
No, but you as Africans, and I think Alimadi is right, because when you think about it, they are capitalists. When they are there, it's pretend. There's no logic to it. They're telling you they're giving you a service.
NATO is there. NATO is there because uranium is not something you sell on the open market. You can only use, what are you going to use uranium? You enrich it for nuclear weapons. You use it for industrial power.
Equipment as well.
Yeah, industrial power and what have you. So whatever the military gets out of it is what is channeled to all other industries. You don't go in and extract yellow cake and put it on the open market. Yeah, because they have to also guide where this stuff ends up. Because one thing you don't want to do is, they know what is extracted in, which is quite even painful to admit. They have an understanding of what is extracted in terms of yellow cake, which is uranium when it comes out of the floor, across all the mines. And they have to keep tabs on it. That is why, even despite the fact that the US is currently fighting Russia, they still get enriched uranium from Russia for their weapons. So, yes, we can fight each other, but we need to also be strategic. So the reason I say there is no price per se in terms to the African, maybe the price is probably, but it's not monetary. The price is probably,
has value, is what I'm saying.
I think, excuse me, folks, I think we are going a little bit of a tangent. I think your question was, how do they get compensated, right?
Yes. How do these Western entities
get compensated? And I'm saying they get compensated by plundering.
Exactly.
Right? So in Gabon, they plunder the oil.
Yes.
They see that as their compensation.
Which is why we're not making money out of
Mali,
them getting it.
They were plundering uranium as well. They see that as compensation. Yeah. And they see themselves as, how dare the Africans question us? We are doing them a favor by being here. And that's the impression that they try to sell to the world. That we are making a sacrifice of French lives, risking our lives. That's the propaganda they spread to the rest of the world. And then, so some misguided people could say, why are these Africans fighting against something that is good for them?
Exactly.
You have 1,500 French troops there helping you fight the jihadis, and you're protesting against them. So the Africans look like the ones that are insane. When in fact, the French are plundering the resources of Niger, of Mali, and all those other countries that they pretend to be doing altruistic intervention in. That is the propaganda that we are in a position to counter. They don't care about, how many people die in Mali. If they could have the jihadis kill everybody in Mali, but spare the uranium fields, they would be absolutely fine with that, you know?
Yeah. All right. So Nguema, as far as him taking over and whether, because you have people arguing whether it's a revolution or a coup, he has been in this family for years, in the Bongo family, working very closely with them and tolerating a lot of the wrongs they were doing for years. So why now? Like, that's the question. You call out Nguema and you say to him, Bryce Nguema, you want to say that you're helping the people, you're carrying out this coup for the people. But like Baba Rodney says, when you run a movement, it has to be from the point of view of the people. Nguema is completely removed from the people, is what we see, right? He's been an elite and for years and years, and he never stood up for the people. So that's another thing I'm calling out when it comes to this not being a revolution.
I think Brother Adesoji already answered the question about Gabon very early on in the conversation. And in fact, I think when we're doing our notes and preparation, he also mentioned something that I don't think is mentioned today.
He can go ahead.
The fact that the family, maybe you can elaborate on that,
Mm-hmm.
the family had been charged or indicted by French authorities. I don't know the details. You brought that up.
Yeah, he did hint to it. Go ahead.
Brother Adesoji.
Yes, the family had already been indicted for, wait for it, money laundering and the acquisition of some questionable assets in Paris.
By the French.
By the French.
Yeah, by the French, yes.
Business of Africa being legally by the French.
But I think the biggest story is that is a sign that you're becoming persona non grata. You can't get any clearer than that, you know?
Exactly. And so curious thing is, when did this happen? This happened just as we were going into the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So again, it ties in with the discovery of the oil field, which the Americans had started, looking into. And so the understanding was it was going to be given to an American company to prospect. The French were not particularly enamored about it. And so with him, obviously very exposed in Paris. And then the stroke happened. So they couldn't move on him then. So they can't move on him directly. So they had to ensure that the atmosphere was right. So this election, post-election situation, with the results being questionable, and knowing fully well that if the opposition does gain traction and it becomes a popular uprising, a situation of what arose in Mali was likely to happen.
Yep.
The French then decided, you know what, I think, let's just leave that as speculation at the moment. I think it was the French hidden hand asking Bryce Nguema to go in. So when you mentioned Nguema, the name you wanted was across the pond in Equatorial Guinea. Nguema Mbasongo.
Yes.
Who has been in power for over 50 odd years. And people can look up to him. Equatorial Guinea is his country. It's not even the size of Manhattan.
Oil rich.
But oil rich. So, but the people also live in abject poverty, just like in Gabon. So, question is, we can't readily label this as a revolutionary coup because it is
reactionary. It looks like
it is opportunistic. Before the ball gets kicked into the American court, let's grab it.
Preemptive strike.
Preemptive strike, really, yes. In geopolitics terms, preemptive strike. Mm. And the thing also is, both of them, the French and the American, have not come outrightly to condemn it. Yeah. They've been quiet. They're relatively quiet in terms of their reaction. Exactly.
The EU has said they are against a military intervention.
Yes.
They're talking again.
Very vague.
That's the boilerplate. Right. That's the boilerplate response. Right. We're against.
Where's the threat of intervention?
Yeah.
You know,
The encouraging
why?
of
Look about it. Look at the disparity between that. In one case, you have 1 week. In the other case, no mention about possible intervention.
And then the guy says transition.
It's a godsend, I say.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing based on what I was thinking as Adesoji was speaking. Leon Mba, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first
president,
died in a French hospital. He was being treated, right? They found his replacement, Omar Bongo, father of Ali Bongo. So earlier on, I speculated that, you know, could he have lived longer? Who knows, right? But he was being treated in France. Where did Ali Bongo, after his stroke, where did he go for treatment? Not France.
He went to the United States.
And Morocco. Think about that. Why not France?
He knew. He knew. People don't do right.
I think he was thinking the same way that we are thinking too. You know?
Like the last time one of us went there, they didn't come back.
And I think that also adds to the same point that Adesoji was making about the family being indicted on these things. You know, I think that, you know, he knew by the time he had his stroke where to go for treatment. And it's very glaring. In retrospect, at that time, I didn't think much about it. But now in retrospect, now I see why he did not go for treatment in France.
Listen, Africa is a joke. I was watching Dr. Arikana as well as I was doing my research. And she's cautioning us because as far as Gabon goes, she's saying, and yes, Adesoji spoke about Gabon, but still today, that's our topic today, and coups in general. She was saying, actually, she was talking about coups in general because she spoke about Zimbabwe as well, and the fact that it might be next on the list. So just stick to your radios. Zimbabwe might be next week on Tuesday or Wednesday. We don't know. But she was saying that we as Africans need to stop falling for this coup. There's a coup and running and trying to figure out what's going on, because what she has learned from her years working with these people is that they're playing both sides. They will be supporting the sitting government and the opposition at the same time. So there are no good guys.
We're not saying they're good guys.
But when we talk about it's a revolution, because the people who are removed from African affairs always say these are new people coming to bring change, but they're not. They're all being manipulated and used by the West. So for us Africans moving forward, like, how are we going to have a scenario that Walter Rodney is encouraging? How do we build that? How do we?
All right. So now,
we who are learning the history and knowing what needs to be done, how do we reach the masses and start a movement that frees Africa?
Okay, so I would like, with your indulgence, to read a short passage here from one of our favorite books.
Thank you.
Black Africa by Cheke Anta Diop. And this is the last chapter where he was interviewed by Carlos Moore. And the question was, since the early 1960s, the African continent has shown itself to be coup prone. How do you account for the growing political instability of African regimes? This is, think about it. He's responding, this interview was in the 1970s. Since the early 19s, I had foreseen the South Americanization of the African continent. And in my work, and people that speak French, excuse me, I'm just going to read it English style.
Listen, mess it up.
I'm not even going to pretend to be.
I will give you more points if you mess it up.
I'll read it in English. In his work, Les Fondements, I guess it means fundamentals, right?
The fundamentals.
Culturel.
The fundamental culturals.
Technique et industrielle de un futur État fédéral Afrique noire. Published in 1960. I alluded to this phenomenon earlier. Think about this. Even earlier, in 1956, I also touched on this subject in an article, Alerta sur les tropiques, This was published in 1956, warning that unless we took care, the African continent, upon independence, would go down the road of South Americanization. No matter how much one may claim that history doesn't repeat itself, I have nonetheless been haunted by Simon Bolivar's failure to unite the South American continent in a single bloc. It can no longer be denied that Africa is the victim of South Americanization, that Africa is politically unstable is a fact. We can't even talk anymore about Balkanization, since the Balkan regimes are stable, whereas in Africa, we have a change of regime almost every week or every month, at any rate, every year. And this stability is growing. In my opinion, what has been lacking are national leadership, which could set an example. Had this been the case, military overthrows would have been made much more difficult. At any rate, stability in Africa would have been much greater. Political selfishness is killing Africa. It's the basis of the problem. Once African interests become merely a pretext for individual selfishness, instability necessarily rears its head. When the only organized force in the country, the army, ceases to respect the civilians in power, it will seize power for itself.
Is that Nkrumah?
No, this is
no, that's Chekata Diop.
Oh yes, Cheka. I was like, that sounds very familiar.
The thing is, people focus so much on his work, on the origins of ancient
civilization
and African origins of Egypt and all that stuff. And many people are unaware that he got into that path because they wanted to solve the same challenges that Nkrumah was fighting against.
Yes.
African division, those days they used the term Balkanization, African inferiorization of Africans, So they're not familiar with a lot of his good stuff, including what I just read right now.
I want to tap into where he mentioned the leadership's individual selfishness. In his book, Remembering a Dismembered Continent, Ayiku Ama, he also points out the fact that most of these leaders have no idea of what it is they've inherited, so much so that they're now fighting coups, they're fighting wars over lines that have been drawn around them. They're willing to fight each other to the death over lines that have been fought, that have been drawn around them. So much, the absurdity of which the guy we were talking about, the good Captain Thomas Sankara, in the 1970 war between Burkina Faso and Mali, otherwise known as the Poor War, because they were essentially fighting over a patch of land between, there is no minerals in there, there is no water, it's basically sand. And he said, the absurdity of this is, look at us, we're wasting resources that we don't have, lives to fight wars that are totally unnecessary. So what Ayiku Ama was talking about there is the collapsing of said borders. Only one leader at the start of independence enshrined that in their constitution. And it was, Kwame Nkrumah, who said in his book, Africa Must Unite, when Africans are indeed ready for the greater African project, we've enshrined it in our constitution to collapse our borders. Only Ghana has it enshrined in their constitution. No other country. So wherein Europe is talking about using a single currency, borderless Europe, where you could just turn up and walls through, Africa doesn't have that interconnected. I mean, people do walk across the borders, don't get me wrong. But the concept that you can just wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm going from Nigeria and I'm going to South Africa. I should be there in 2 days, or I should be there in 24 hours, is a concept that is beyond anyone's imagination on the continent.
Right. Or not get beaten and killed when you do get a job in South Africa because you're from Nigeria.
Exactly.
Something that thankfully Malema was condemning very strongly.
Exactly.
I like that. But to build on what you just said, you gave the example of Europe. In this same book, and Job has a great sense of humor too. He said, Africans emulate and ape anything that is European. So this is a good thing to actually ape, that Europe is coming together now. So the countries that have come together and that could be seen as powers because they came together with the United States, at that time the Soviet Union and China. And he said Europe is now doing the same thing, coming together, trying to come with a common government, common economic policies. He says, since Africans like emulating what Europeans do, I hope they follow this example. He said, this is the only thing I would support them copying from Europe, African unity.
That's a good one. Yep, I agree with him. It's a good one, and I agree with him. I just shared in the chat an article that I read from Foreign Affairs, and when I read it, it stank of Western propaganda, Western media propaganda. But I was shocked right now as I was going to check the article to find out it was written by a Nigerian American. Yeah, I'll send it to you both, brothers, to see. It's talking about the coups and the fact that this uprising is coming because people, the argument that is being made as we talk about these coups, that people of Africa are tired of the West and they're complaining about the West's influence. And this man is arguing that the elites do not really want to get rid of the West, and he doesn't think that Africans will really get rid of the West because apparently they are comfortable with them being there. This is just pretend.
Because he's comfortable, you know?
Yeah.
He's a reactionary, and that's why Foreign Affairs would publish something like that.
Yeah.
But regardless of what the elites say, at the end of the day, events are determined by the people on the ground.
That's it.
Right? There are thousands, tens of thousands of people showing up to protest outside the French military base in Niger. It's not because they have a particular hatred for the French or Europeans. In fact, they've been adoring and praising French Europeans for all these decades. They are responding to their impoverished condition. Now, the current regime is using the propaganda effectively, which is a true propaganda, by the way, that your condition is because of the French plundering our uranium and all the previous governments allowing them to do so. At the end of the day, they're hoping that their conditions change. They have a better standard of life. That's not going to change just because 1,500 French soldiers leave, but they see that as one of the things that need to be done to get toward that path. The next thing they want is, of course, to get better compensation for whomever they sell their uranium to, you know?
I think, like,
so let that guy write whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Foreign Affairs. Did he, in fact, interview any one of those young people that are coming out to protest? Of course not, because the elite don't do that. Rodney was in tune because he engaged with the so-called, what did Hillary call them? The deplorables, right? He interacted with the deplorables.
Yeah, we're going to go to the questions from the audience since we're past the hour. Muata Garai asks, is there a great game being played between the US and France? The US has dealt a blow to Germany. Is France the next on the US hit list? I had responded to him and said yes. My answer was basically the French are already on the chopping board. You've seen all the headlines and strained relations between France and the US.
Listen, the Berlin conference was held because Europeans were on the verge of killing each other.
They don't get along, yeah.
To conquer territory in Africa, you see? So obviously, they always look for their best interests. But when it makes interest, they come together as a collective. In Berlin, they said, no. If there's any dying and killing to be done, let the victims be Africans. We, as European gentlemen, let's put the map here and just chop it up. You get this, you get that, you get this. So they're always looking for opportunities and advantage. The US ambassador has not been expelled in Niger. Think about that, because the US did not officially call this a coup. You see? The French called it a coup. The French have supported intervention The French want it to be reversed. The US has not been that explicit. So when it comes to certain situations, they're always willing to ditch each other.
Adesoji, any thoughts on that?
My answer would be, well, there is a big, yes, there is a great play, but it's not been orchestrated by the French. It's more being orchestrated by what they fear could happen if they lose power.
Yep.
So it's the fear of the BRICS countries
I see
that is now forcing their hands to act where they would previously not have done anything.
In other words, desperate.
Exactly. So
it's go on, Adesoji.
For them now, it's so much as what do we need to do in order not to lose ground? So where normally they would have asked each other, what are you doing here? People have been, acting out of kilter. With France seeking to join BRICS, obviously the Americans will be looking at them side-eye to think, what are you doing? Are you about to leave this side to go join that side? So, like I said earlier, when the oil was discovered, it called into question, France's loyalty to the Western hegemonies project, which is like, we can't be fighting over this thing. No. I will tell you when to come in. You don't just come into my territory and start, But your man there says it's okay if I do. Okay, which man? They remove him. Now, who are you referring to? There you go. So again, it's what is outside as opposed to what is within the circle. The circle is basically acting based on what they see coming from the outside. If the Chinese were to get involved in Gabon today, it's cuttings for both of them, and they know it. So France, like I said earlier, France might not want to lose Gabon. We definitely not want to lose Gabon the way it lost Niger. Because there is a lot more to lose in Gabon than in Niger Republic. Gabon actually has uranium, it has iron ore, it has oil, and also gas. Niger doesn't have those two, the last two. So sometimes you gotta give to give.
The French are in a very weak position, and the U.S. knows that too. And the U.S., as an imperial power, does not mind if France becomes much weaker. I mean, France in Africa projects itself as much more powerful than Britain, right? Of course, at one time, Britain was the imperial, power and glory. And the U.S. is aware of that too. So if France would not abandon the U.S. anyway. France would still have to maintain that so-called special relationship with the U.S. And the U.S. would not mind if it's in more of a driver's seat relative to this relationship. They know that if France loses the exploitation they gain from Niger, eventually perhaps from Gabon in the future, it's already happening even in Senegal, right? France will be a very diminished, quote unquote, power. And the US will be able to call more of the shots,
Yeah. And as you talk, I'm thinking economics now, that and thinking of Bretton Woods, that their goal was to make the US dollar the power currency. So if you have one that's in the way, you want to get it out of the way to continue growing as the global currency, as you consider yourself. But Walter Rodney in Crisis in the Periphery, I'll go back to the audience quickly. But as Adesoji was talking, I remembered this. When you mentioned BRICS and China, he's making fun. Remember when he makes fun of the large prime ministers? Remember that? Yeah. And he says that he will not even be surprised if tomorrow he wakes up and they are siding with the Japanese yen as the new currency for Africa, right?
It is timeless. That what year was Christ in the Periphery? Was it 79, I think, when he made that?
Yeah, 79.
I think it was at Howard University. And he's talking about the currency. He's saying now we're banking all our hopes on the US dollar. Mm-hmm. But the way things are changing, who knows? With some of these leaders, maybe large and small, tomorrow they may be banking on the Japanese yen because, of course, Japan was really in a position where China is today, emerging as the preeminent other global economic power. Mm-hmm. So that lecture is timeless, but all of his lectures are timeless, you know?
Yes, but it goes to when he says that, I'm thinking Africa's relationship now with China and Africa's relationship with BRICS, where our large prime ministers are always looking out instead of within to fix the problems of Africa, and very quick to jump on the next boat that is setting off to sail. This is another question or statement that we can discuss, I guess. Also, there are reports that Ali Bongo, I guess this is a good one, because if it is the Western media putting out this information, it's good for us to clear it up, right? Also, there were reports that Ali Bongo's sister did not want Ali's son to come to power after his father, and therefore she organized the coup with her cousin Nguema.
Very possible, very credible.
Family drama, apparently.
But as I said earlier, any such games would be transitional. The young people are watching what's really going on in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and now in Niger. I don't think a stopgap coup, which it seems like what it is, would stay for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And also, I would add that this game is quite bigger than Game of Thrones. So it will probably be, there are bigger players at play here.
Of course, absolutely.
Internal
family squabbles, right?
Internal family dynamics. They are, this sort of people are expendable.
Yeah, but thank you, Adesoji, because it just reminded me of something as you were saying that. What are his first comments, right?
Nguema's or
Ali Bongo?
Ali Bongo.
Yes.
I'm here. My son.
My wife is.
My son,
I don't know where my son is.
My son, I don't know what's happening. My wife is somewhere. I'm here. Look at the key things he's talking about.
He's not worried about the.
You're not talking about the welfare of the nation. Is this army going to disrupt? He knows it's not a democracy. Is this military going to disrupt democracy? How are they intervening at a time when we're having this election, when I've just been reelected and given a new mandate, blah, 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 blah. You'd expect the things for president to be saying. But to him, the most important pieces are my wife, my son.
My son.
Boom.
People make noise. Makes lots of noise.
Obviously, you're concerned about your immediate family. But this is how I would say it. I'm concerned about the immediate security of my family. In addition to that, of course, I'm concerned about what these soldiers will do to the welfare of the country, the citizens of this country, and the plans that are put in place to raise the standard of living. You see?
But then if he wouldn't be accumulating wealth at the expense of not distributing to his people.
Thank you. So he's saying what is consistent with who he is.
Let me just tell you, because you've all seen who I am. No need to pretend. Rodney points out something else. I'm going to focus on crisis on the periphery, because he says a lot of things here that I would like us to chop. And maybe we will have a conversation on capitalism and the harms that it has brought on Africa, and whether it works for Africa or not. And a question that Brother Ali Mahdi asked on WBAI's show this week is: capitalism a hate crime? We need to tackle that, because that was an amazing question. I have never attacked it from that angle, but that was like straight.
Yeah, to be honest with you, it popped during the conversation.
It did.
It was not a connection that I had before that show. But as we kept talking, I realized, wow, this is a true hate crime.
You will excuse the doorbell because I will not be responding to it, so it might ring again. Excuse us. But Rodney says that the West wants to ensure that the classes that arise in Africa will mirror those in the West and ensure the flow of surplus from Africa to the center of capitalism. 100%. So here, this is this is the center of neo-colonialism and why they still survive. And it actually explains the coups and how they keep bringing people we think are going to help, but they never help. So let's talk about that quickly before we end.
Well, I mean, you stated it. There's no objection to that. If you look at each and every African country, the leadership reflect their counterparts in the former colonial establishments. And that was Rodney's problem. And he said independence was a necessary condition, but it was not sufficient condition. So like the struggle ended at independence, because now I got the job that the European governor had. I'm the leader now. Struggle is over, you know?
I mean, also to chime in with that is what sort of foundation was left for said countries?
Exactly.
There was no, there was no adequate infrastructure. In some cases, like in the Congo, there were just 60 high school students in the entire country, not a single medical doctor, So one would argue that most of these countries were, in fact, to quote René Dumont in his book, False Start to Africa, they were set up to fail from beginning.
You should add that book, by the way, on there.
What book is this?
No, for really.
False Start in Africa.
It's a brilliant title. Yeah, false, like wrong. False start.
False Start.
Brilliant title.
I'm actually looking at it over there. False Start in Africa. René Dumont.
FALC, false.
And so, most of these countries were set up to fail. And so what are we now seeing? The French specifically picked certain people, otherwise known as the Evoyer. So with the Evoyer, you had prized peacocks who were then placed on public display for you to look at. Houphouët-Boigny, Léopold Senghor, what's his name? Eyadema. But all of, what do they all have in common? They served and looked to French for advice. They looked to France. So they never thought about the offerings of their people. And when one of our commentators in the chat said, kids are now making fun of the leaders, you all remember what happened to Idi Amin in the end. It's not like Idi Amin is one great revolutionary, but in the end, he became a caricature of what the West wanted to create, a buffoon that, look, this is what you call a leader. This is who you think are your leaders.
This is what they do with power, right?
Exactly. So should we be surprised? What Rodney tells us not. In how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Your school system, your education system, your cultural practices were all diluted to the point of no credible reference points. And what has the young population done? You've now subscribed to the Western education system. You've left the farm, now you're in the cities, seeking jobs that don't exist.
Right.
It's akin to probably my Nigerian people would not want me say this. You build your churches in industrial complexes and you're praying to God for salvation. Even God will look at you and start laughing. You're in a freak. You are in a factory, for crying out loud. How can you be praying to me in a factory? For what?
Yeah.
More produce in the factory.
Exactly. So if you now look at the African countries, it's not that the people do not know what to do. It's not that the infrastructure is there. It's that the people, the leaders, have been acting as a wedge between the people, their aspirations, and their colonial masters.
Walter Rodney points that out too in Crisis in the Periphery.
And that's it.
Yeah.
So the French-speaking folks were much more vicious in terms of maintaining their puppets in their former colonies, like in the Belgians killing Lumumba and installing Moise Tshombe initially, and then Mobutu. The French killing Felix Mumi in Cameroon. And then you have Ahidjo, and then after that, it's been Paul Biya, going almost a century. The British did the same, but in a different way. They had them locked up. So once they shook hands with Kenyatta in Kenya, they had Odinga Oginga, people like Ocheng Oneko locked up, although some were killed. Like Tom Mboya was killed.
Yes. Dedan Kimathi was killed. Let's not forget him.
Pio Gama was killed. Yeah.
They ran out Mr. Mugo.
Yep. And Gogi.
Yep. Exile them. But the French were much more vicious in like just exterminating them. Yeah.
So, Walter, last question, and then we can close. He says that we've been trapped by the question, and I when I heard this, and again, like I said, every time I listen, I get something to hold. I've listened to this before, but this never stood out to me as it did this time.
Every time, I guarantee.
Right, and I think it stood out because I'm now encountering and confronting this issue. When we've been trapped by the question, what changes should be made, right? When you go and talk about Africa, the situation in Africa, we need to make a change. You'll have these, especially the elite, asking you, so what do you suggest? What are we going to do? Right. And Walter is saying that is blocking us. That has been the fool's errand, because now we are stuck on, okay, let me put down together a program on how we are going to do this. But he advises to concentrate more on who will do the changes. Who will do the changes? And who has the right to reassess the situation as opposed to how are we going to do it? So what do you both think about that? And this goes to the coup, right? You have Nguema. Is Nguema the right person to do this?
No, Nguema is not a factor. It's not an issue at all.
Yeah.
Like, I won't spend any valuable thought time thinking about Nguema. The people in this, going to the question you just posed, the people would be the students, the young people. And sadly, they've been deprived of access. That is why now you see them all over social media, really trying to educate themselves and uplift their consciousness. They know that they don't know what they need to know. So that's positive, you see? And they're the ones that need to lead the country, because number one, they are actually the majority population. You see? The youngest continent. We have a tyrant, 80 years old, in Uganda, been there for going on 40 years in power, and wants to obviously continue. You see, we can't have that, because the opportunity cost of denying young people leadership, it is so destructive, because they're in tune with the modern technology, right? And they would elevate Africa so much more rapidly if given the opportunity to be in positions of authority and power. So that's how I would address Rodney's questions. Let the youth of Africa determine the future of Africa.
But again,
you're muted.
Any thoughts on Baba Rodney as we close, Adesoji?
Yeah, but again, just like Baba Rodney said, if he then spotted the fact that in how Europe underdeveloped Africa, that the tools of governance was denied them. Surely there should be a way of running leadership through the present framework, and then in the course of time, iron out the kinks of said framework. Because if we are to just quote unquote, just toss out the baby with the bathwater, would we not end up doing the continent a great disservice? The likes of Julius Malema, if were to come to power, his thoughts process are actually what the continent needs. Now, juxtapose that with the youths in Zimbabwe, Chimisa, or counter that with Bobby Wine in Uganda.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can see you have two youths that have their priorities straight on. And then one that still wants to move towards the imperialist powers. So question is, what is the youths? And are youths really ready? Because there's a old phrase which is he who fails to study his history would repeat the mistakes of the past. Most of us need to do a lot more study, in order to be ready for whatever is coming forward. Because if you don't understand what it is you're looking, how would you know how to react to it?
I agree with that. Unfortunately, the learning curve is going to be very,
very steep.
And
there's no time, because the current leadership have built up so much frustration that if the youth are not allowed to be in positions of authority, I'm afraid we may start seeing explosive, chaotic conditions where they just, start going on a rampage. The potential is there.
Yeah.
Because the impoverishment is.
So we continue here.
And at the end of the day, my final word is that a united African Federation is the ultimate solution. And that's what I convey to all the youth, whether it's in Uganda, South Africa. I'm glad that Malema is already talking about that. Borderless Africa,
Did you finish your thought, brother?
Oh, I'm good.
All right. Thank you. And yes. And thank you all for joining us, Asanteni. And we look forward to having more and more conversations and bringing this history that Adesoji is talking about to you all, wherever you may be. And we hope that it's going to reach more people, especially on the continent, those who are not informed, and even in the diaspora. Thank you all. Have a good Sunday afternoon and the rest of your day. Blessings to you all. Kwaherini. Siku njema.